Materials used in this presentation are period in nature and used for educational and entertainment purposes. Furthermore, videos have been used in conjunction with the photographs to produce continuity, in some instances are composites, and fall within the purview of the fair use doctrine of U.S. copyright laws. Attributions are given when required.
Welcome to the True Crime Man's Dark Imagination YouTube channel, your one destination for the most factual, engrossing profiles of crime on the internet. Please like, subscribe, and hit the bell so that you'll receive future notifications of upcoming episodes. And tell your friends about us.
The Kingsbury Run district of Cleveland, Ohio had always been an eyesore that embarrassed the city. Due to the massive joblessness caused by the Great Depression, Kingsbury Run became a haven for the unemployed and the penniless. Homeless shacks appeared as fires lit the night sky, penetrating the darkness that surrounded the hopeless men and women. In this atmosphere appeared a killer so brutal and merciless that authorities gave him the title of the Mad Butcher. After his reign of terror ceased, at least 12 and as many as 20 victims lay in his wake, and a famous crime fighter's career forever blemished with the one that got away.
In September of 1934, a woman's torso with the thighs still attached washed onto the shores of Lake Erie near Cleveland, Ohio. After an analysis of the body, the coroner discovered that the body had been drenched in some sort of chemical that turned, quote, her skin red and textured like leather, end quote. The press then dubbed the corpse as the, quote, Lady of the Lake, end quote. Her head would never be found, and therefore authorities were never able to identify her. On September 23, 1935 in Cleveland, Ohio, teenagers walking through Kingsbury Run found the body of a man stripped nude with just a pair of socks. The body had been washed clean, and the wrists showed signs of rope burns. His body had the testicles removed. Detectives Emil Musil and Orly May arrived on the scene first and found not one headless body, but two. Police identified one of the bodies as being that of Edward Andrassy, a suspected gay prostitute that worked the areas adjacent to Kingsbury Run. The other corpse sustained the same injuries as Andrassy, but this one would go without being identified. At both crime scenes, little blood existed. The bodies appeared to have been washed, but detectives Musil and May found the missing heads of both corpses. The second corpse demonstrated the same signs as the, quote, Lady of the Lake, end quote, with reference to the chemical drenching of the body. Authorities believed that both men had been dispatched as a result of being killed with either a large knife or an axe. Both corpses sustained incredible wounds and denigration. One detective, Bernard Wood, learned that Andrassy had been visited by a middle-aged man that threatened the former petty criminal to stop seeing his wife or the man would kill Andrassy. For the rest of 1935, the city remained quiet, but in January 1936, authorities discovered the body of a middle-aged woman who the killer placed in two separate baskets near a manufacturing plant. Her body had been disemboweled. Police identified her as middle-aged Florence Polillo, a sex worker in the Cleveland area. Detectives Musil and May did an extensive background check on Polillo to flush any leads as to whom may have committed this grotesque act. What they found led to a very sad story indeed. Neighbors and the woman's landlady told that Polillo was a kind, gentle woman, but was prone to drink and fits of aggressiveness whenever the alcohol was plied. Polillo had a very extensive doll collection, which she allowed her landlady's 3 daughters to play with when she was home. Moreover, Polillo would engage in abusive relationships with men, which sometimes left her on crutches or with swollen lips or black eyes. At one time, Polillo lived a very pleasant life, and when police found her body, they called her ex-husband in Buffalo, New York, to come to Cleveland and give a statement to police. It must be noted that Polillo associated with the very dregs of society, pimps, whores, tavern owners, and bootleggers. But when questioned, none of them even knew that Polillo had been murdered. Police later found the rest of her body behind a vacant house, and because of the recent cold snap in the city, the cold preserved the parts for analysis. The coroner surmised that because the muscles of her neck had retracted, that decapitation was the cause of death. Even with the same signature that allegedly tied the 4 murders together to one killer, officials were hesitant to state that one killer was responsible for those 4 deaths. After all, the city prepared for the 1936 Republican Convention, and any negative press about the city found its way to the back pages of the newspapers. The mayor at the time, Harold Burton, promised a program that overhauled the police department, and the organization of systematic raids on organized crime hangouts promised to clean up the city and provide a positive atmosphere for the citizens in the upcoming convention. Eliot Ness, the Treasury agent of Untouchables fame, had been made the Director of Public Safety by Mayor Burton, and the city expected big things from such a famous lawman. On June 5, 1936, delegates began arriving in the city and placed Ness and his officers on high alert. But on that Friday morning, before the commencement of the convention, police discovered another body. This time, the corpse seemed adorned with tattoos, known thereafter as the, quote, tattooed man, end quote. The victim had been decapitated, but the police recovered the man's head. They made a death mask of the severed head, but no one stepped forward to identify the latest victim. Coroner Arthur J. Pierce estimated that the man had been dead for 2 days, yet his head had been separated from his body while the victim was still alive. Police officially labeled the unknown victim as, quote, John Doe number 2, end quote. The victim, found at Morgan Run near East 55th Street, was estimated to be between 20 and 23 years old, light complexion, reddish-brown hair, chestnut-colored eyes, and stood between 5'10" or 5'11" feet tall. Slender build, weighed 165 pounds. The victim had several unusual tattoos on his body. One included a bird and band and included the names of, quote, Helen and Paul, end quote, on the inner side of the left forearm. Another tattoo on the outer side of the right forearm was a heart and anchor in red and blue. On the other side was a flag with the initials, quote, WCG, end quote. A butterfly was tattooed on his left shoulder. A head of a comic character, Jiggs, was tattooed on his left leg at the ankle, and, quote, Cupid, end quote, was tattooed on his right leg at the ankle. His underwear bore the laundry mark that identified the person with the initials, quote, JD, end quote. The tattooed man did not appear as the run-of-the-mill hobos in the Kingsbury Run area. His clothing appeared to be newer. He was clean-shaven and well-nourished. Because of the examination of this victim, Dr. Pierce realized a disturbing pattern emerging with the killings. Decapitation is extremely difficult to accomplish. If someone is killing these unfortunates through decapitation only, the victims either had to be sedated or knew their killer. Just before the beginning of the Republican Convention, the powers that be in Cleveland could not restrain the local newspapers from reporting what Clevelanders already knew. Furthermore, the media announced there was a psychopathic maniac on the loose in the city. Eliot Ness met secretly with his new head of the Homicide Division, Sergeant James Hogan, and his newly appointed head of the Crime Lab, David Coles. Ness desired to know the opinions each investigator had regarding the murders. Hogan pointed out the distinctions between the various victims, while Coles believed that a single killer murdered all of the victims thus far. The two investigators waited for their new boss to make his assessment. Ness then turned to Hogan and stated, "Jim, you've got a real problem on your hands. The same guy did them all. Too much similarity to be coincidental. Death by decapitation. The expert hand with a knife, bodies all cleaned up and neat. I can't tell why he kills women one way and men another, but it's the same man, I guarantee you." Ness then made it clear to both men that the newspapers were not to be alerted to the fact that the police were looking for a single killer, and that no further information was to be furnished the media about the murders during the convention. Ness then said to Hogan that he knew the detective sergeant would do everything in his power to catch the, quote, "maniac," end quote, and Cowles would put his crime lab at the complete disposal of the sergeant in apprehending this fiend. This signified to the investigators that Ness would not get involved in the investigation any more than he had to. Ness's job at this point was to root out corruption in the police force, the task assigned to him by Mayor Burton. The Republican convention proved to be a great success, with the delegates nominating Alfred Landon as their candidate to run against Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and Ness's security protocols worked perfectly. Immediately after the convention came the Great Lakes Exposition, where people from all over the world came to Cleveland. The coroner made death masks and exhibited them at the Great Lakes Exposition in the summer of 1936. With thousands of persons filing past the death mask, police could still not identify the tattooed man. On July 22, 1936, Detective Orley May reported that Sergeant Hogan arrived at the Big Creek area where a teenage girl discovered the body of a male victim near a hobo camp. Police believed the victim to be a 40-year-old man. Quote, "The dead man was lying on his stomach in the nude, and the head was partly wrapped up in his clothing about 15 feet north of the body. It appeared that the body had been lying at this point for at least 2 months and was very badly decomposed." End quote. His clothing contained quite a bit of mud, and the garments piled up next to his head. The coat contained bloodstains. The coroner, Dr. Pierce, exhibited some doubt as to whether this victim had actually been murdered by the same person as the others. Upon his examination, Dr. Pierce noted that the body was in an advanced state of decomposition, with the skin missing in certain large areas of the corpse. Because of the decomposition, fingerprinting was impossible. Other than the clothing, no other clues existed as to identify the body. Authorities recovered his head, but this victim still went unidentified. In mid-September 1936, the American Legion Convention was set to commence in Cleveland, which would signify a nice ending to the summer following the Republican Convention and the Great Lakes Expo. But still, a grotesque killer was on the loose. On September 10, 1936, a hobo named Jerry Harris sat near the East 37th Street Pier waiting for an eastbound freight train. When he looked into the water, Harris noticed 2 halves of a human torso floating in the creek. After police dragged the creek for the remainder of the body, they subsequently found the legs that had been cut below the knees, but were unable to find a head. Police also recovered clothing, but the police never identified this victim. Sergeant Hogan felt that the hysteria grew, and when the local newspaper dubbed the killer as, quote, "the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run," end quote, Sergeant Hogan believed that the hysteria could no longer be contained. As a result of law enforcement frustration with the apprehension and capture of the killer, Ness decided to assume command of the investigation. This as a result of Sergeant Hogan mentioning to a local newspaper that the killer may live within the Kingsbury Run area. Ness became agitated at the remark and thus took control of the investigation. This interrupted Ness's investigation into police department graft. Ness urged his department to bring in every hobo for questioning and warned them to find somewhere else to live until the killer could be apprehended. And Ness assigned 20 detectives to the case full-time to follow every lead, interview every witness, and investigate, quote, "suspicious persons," end quote. The detectives also tried some pretty unorthodox methods to catch the killer, including, but not limited to, dressing as hobos and mingling with the other hobos in Kingsbury Run. Other detectives went into the seedier areas of Cleveland, into gay bars and dens of prostitution to discover the identity of the killer. The head of the Federal Narcotics Bureau in Cleveland even made the statement that a marijuana user was responsible for the murders. The Cleveland News offered a reward of $1,000 for any information leading to the apprehension and prosecution of the, quote, "Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run," end quote. The Cleveland City Council met to consider a like-minded reward. Detectives believed that the killer played games with them, leaving the discarded bodies close to the railroad police office, and even later one would be found near a police precinct office. The absence of evidence denoted to the police that this killer was not only cunning, but exhibited determined skills to take apart human bodies with no remorse and with a psychopathy never before seen by the detectives assigned to the case. The one thing either they or the media could not figure out was motive. What motive drove someone to commit such horrific murders and then taunt everyone with his elusiveness? Ness decided to assemble some experts to determine the type of individual they looked for through their various operations. Dr. Pierce and Dr. Reuben Strauss, a coroner who performed some of the earlier autopsies, met with Ness, along with now Lieutenant Coles and Sergeant Hogan, and at the end of the day determined a rudimentary profile of the killer. One man working alone murdered the 6 known victims. The Lady of the Lake was not included in the official count because the murder occurred in 1934, a full year before the Andrassy murder. The killer was not obviously insane, but there were disagreements as to whether the killer was a homosexual. The other mutilations to the body, sans the testicles, may have been an effort to keep the bodies from being identified or transporting the bodies. The killer had a working knowledge of anatomy, not necessarily a physician or surgeon, but someone who would know the anatomical landmarks, such as a butcher. The killer was large and strong, considering the bodies had to be carried great distances. The killer was, most likely, a resident of Kingsbury Run. The killer had a private place to murder and dismember his victims, as the decapitation, especially when in some of the murders this was the main cause of death, would produce venal and arterial spray. The killer chose his victims from the lowest classes of society, therefore people not likely to be missed, or the killer expressed the need to eliminate, quote, undesirables, end quote, from society. The panel also believed that the killer improved his means of remaining undetected as the murders went on, removing heads and hands, leaving the bodies to be found without these anatomical pieces that could produce identification. And, with the examination of the placement of the victims within Kingsbury Run, the killer increased risks to intimidate the police and getting caught by continually using the area as his graveyard. After the 6th victim, Eliot Ness allocated plentiful resources to the case. One of the detectives working the case, Peter Merillo, stood out. Merillo spoke several European languages and began his career as a motorcycle cop. Although highly intelligent, Merillo was also eccentric. Merillo expressed an extreme acumen in catching homosexual men in compromising positions. Homosexuality was illegal in Cleveland at the time, and Merillo made it his mission to arrest, quote, perverts, end quote, and put them in jail. Merillo used questionable methods with which to arrest homosexuals, mainly by following 2 men leaving a gay bar to a hotel or a residence, waiting a short time, and then busting in to catch them in a compromising position. Judges were very hesitant to try cases of this nature because of the methods Merillo used. Peter Merillo wanted desperately to be assigned to the Kingsbury Run case and eventually received his wish. On February 23, 1937, the body of an unidentified female was found at Euclid Beach on the Lake Erie shore, approximately near the same spot where the 1934 victim Lady of the Lake had been found. The coroner, newly elected Samuel Gerber, estimated that the body had been there some 3 or 4 days and was missing her head, her arms, and the torso had been bisected. Gerber had unique qualifications for this position. He possessed not only a medical degree, but a law degree as well. He spent countless hours on the research for the case, and Cleveland's fathers expected a great deal from his expertise. Indeed, Dr. Gerber did not disappoint. His assessment of one of the most recent victims stated, "The victim's legs were removed with 2 clean sweeping strokes of a heavy knife, and the arms were removed with the murderer's usual skill. The bisection of the torso showed multiple hesitation marks. Unlike most of the other victims, death did not appear to be caused by decapitation. The blood clots in the heart indicated that the decapitation was post-mortem. The arms, legs, and clothing were never found." Dr. Gerber also added that he believed the perpetrator of these horrendous crimes to be right-handed. using a very heavy, sharp knife, and he had a working knowledge of human anatomy. The new coroner was unable to properly evaluate the sexual undertones associated with the crimes, but the, quote, mad butcher, end quote, appeared to be the first sexual psychopath on record at the time to murder members of both sexes. Because of his involvement with the case and the new information gleaned from Dr. Gerber, Ness contacted his sources in the local newspapers and asked them to, quote, tone down, end quote, the sensationalism associated with the murders in Kingsbury Run. The added publicity for the crimes fed into the killer's ego, and therefore he would be harder to catch. Furthermore, the more publicity the case got, the more useless leads police would have to chase. Dr. Gerber disagreed with Ness, as the coroner had quite the ego himself. Nevertheless, the editors of the local newspapers agreed and held restraint when it came to the publicity surrounding the case. Police dubbed the latest unidentified corpse as, quote, Jane Doe 1, end quote. On June 6, 1937, a teenager named Russell Lawyer found the skeletal remains of a black female within a rotting burlap bag beneath the Lorraine Carnegie Bridge, missing her head and a rib. Police later recovered the head, and the coroner estimated the body had been there for a little over a year before its discovery. Police dubbed this discovery, quote, Jane Doe 2, end quote. Police received a letter claiming the victim to be a prostitute named Rose Wallace. Wallace's dental records matched the corpse, and an identification by her son strongly indicated that this body was that of Rose Wallace. The only doubt that may have hinged upon the identification was the assertion that the coroner stated that this body had been dead for a year. Relatives reported Wallace missing only 10 months before. Dr. Gerber and Sergeant Hogan dismissed this identification, but Detective Merillo firmly believed the corpse found by Lawyer to be that of Rose Wallace. On July 6, 1937, the body of a decapitated male was found floating in the Cuyahoga River in the Cleveland Flats. The head was never recovered, and the coroner estimated that the body had been floating there, in addition to the corpse's 2 thighs. Dr. Gerber estimated the body to have been in the water no less than approximately 2 or 3 days. For a short time after the initial discovery, pieces of this corpse floated downriver, except for the head. With this discovery, the coroner noticed that the internal organs had been removed, but searchers never retrieved them. Police dubbed this victim John Doe 5. Upon more intense examination of the previous victims in comparison to the most recent ones, authorities concentrated on doctors, medical students, nurses, and even butchers. Police soon focused on one doctor in particular, Dr. Frank E. Sweeney. Authorities learned that Dr. Sweeney grew up near the Kingsbury Run area. He had a problem with alcohol that caused him to lose a wife and some visitation with his children, and he lost his license to practice surgery at a nearby hospital. Sweeney also matched the physical profile of what the killer may look like. He was tall, large, and strong. Although this was not well publicized, police believed Sweeney to be bisexual and possessed a very violent temper when he drank alcohol. Later, in 1937, police abandoned Sweeney as a suspect due to his frequent trips out of town, but his name resurfaced throughout the history of the case with any mention of the butcher of Kingsbury Run. Lieutenant Cowles ran across a person of interest that renewed his interest in Dr. Sweeney as a suspect. Lieutenant Cowles learned that the Veterans Hospital where Dr. Sweeney worked shared their services with a prison honor farm. On that honor farm, and at the Veterans Hospital for that matter, a convicted burglar named Alex Archaki was serving out the rest of his sentence in the prison honor farm and began a symbiotic relationship with Dr. Sweeney. Dr. Sweeney, it was reported, often made trips to the prison farm where Archaki would provide Sweeney with alcohol. In exchange, Dr. Sweeney would write prescriptions for barbiturates. Although interesting that Dr. Sweeney openly broke the law through his vocation, Archaki gave Lieutenant Cowles something far more interesting. Archaki stated he first became acquainted with Dr. Sweeney after meeting the physician in a local bar in Cleveland. Dr. Sweeney bought the young man a few drinks and then began asking him some personal questions. Where was Archaki from? Did he have any family in the city? Was Archaki married? Archaki thought nothing of it at the time, but later he believed Dr. Sweeney was interviewing him to become a victim. Archaki also informed Lieutenant Cowles that Dr. Sweeney appeared absent several times from the hospital. These absences coincided with the, quote, estimated times of death for several victims, end quote. Archaki averred his positivity with Lieutenant Cowles about the dates that Dr. Sweeney never appeared at the hospital. Lieutenant Cowles researched Dr. Sweeney's background more thoroughly after acquiring the information from Archaki. The detective learned that Sweeney was born in East Cleveland, just on the outskirts of Kingsbury Run, in 1894. Francis Edward Sweeney grew up in a poor family, losing his mother at 9 years of age. His father received some bad injuries and could not find work. Despite the circumstances he and his siblings faced, Sweeney made a determined effort to make a success of himself. He worked several full-time jobs while attending college. After college, he attended pharmacy school and then medical school, where he proved to be such a popular student that his classmates elected him vice president of their class. After graduating medical school, Sweeney became a surgical resident at St. Alexis Hospital. His siblings remembered that he was very engrossed with his studies and the knowledge he acquired from treating people at the hospital. But he was never too busy when one of his siblings got sick. He left the hospital to attend to them immediately. The pressures of the job began to take its toll, and Sweeney took to drink in order to cope. He was admitted to the hospital for alcoholism on a number of occasions. Since graduating from medical school, Sweeney married in 1927, and when he succumbed to drink, he became violent toward co-workers and abusive towards his wife, forcing his marriage to collapse and his career to disappear before his eyes. He stayed in a period of perpetual drunkenness until finally, in 1934, he and his wife of 7 years separated. Cowles learned that Sweeney suffered several injuries during World War I, including a head injury in which he received a pension. But several of his other psychoses ran in the bloodline, including mental illness. With this new profile, Lieutenant Cowles thought certain that Dr. Sweeney functioned in an alter ego as the, quote, mad butcher of Kingsbury Run, end quote. In March of 1938, a dog found a man's severed leg in Sandusky, Ohio, approximately 65 miles from Cleveland. Lieutenant Cowles traveled to the area in all haste to see whether a connection existed between this body part and the torso killer in Cleveland. Subsequently, it turned out that this body part had been removed through a medical procedure and may have been misplaced, but no connection existed to the torso killer. On April 8, 1939, a human leg had been found in the Cuyahoga River near Cleveland Flats. A conflict developed between Ness and coroner Dr. Gerber, when Ness accused the coroner of desiring a larger national reputation, with Dr. Gerber hungering for publicity in the decapitation cases. It got to the point where whenever the newspapers would print something about the murders, the public accepted Dr. Gerber's word as authority on these types of killings. When Ness insisted that an independent evaluation take place, Dr. Gerber became infuriated and professed, quote, "I answer to the taxpayers, not to the Cleveland Police Department," end quote. On May 8th, a woman's thigh was found near the same location in the river east of the West 4th Street Bridge. Police conducted a search later under the bridge and discovered a burlap sack containing the victim's headless torso cut in half, another thigh, and another foot. The head and arms were never found. On August 16, 1938, another decapitated female corpse was found near the East 9th Street Lakeshore dump. The coroner determined that the body had been dead for the last 4 to 6 months. Police later recovered the head. This became Jane Doe number 4. After the discovery of the female and male victims, Lieutenant Cowles understood the political atmosphere surrounding his prime suspect, Dr. Sweeney. Sweeney was the first cousin of U.S. Senator Martin L. Sweeney. Senator Sweeney, if he realized one of his relatives was suspected of these most horrific murders, the senator would believe a political agenda against him due to the fact that he incessantly criticized Mayor Burton's administration. Lieutenant Cowles decided to engage surveillance on Dr. Sweeney, but had to find someone he trusted to report only the facts and not make any suppositions. Lieutenant Cowles assigned a rookie named Thomas Whalen to follow Dr. Sweeney and record his findings. The elder police veteran believed that the rampant corruption that plagued the Cleveland Police Department for so long had not reached the young, ambitious rookie. When Whalen began his surveillance, he followed Dr. Sweeney into a department store where he observed the physician looking at merchandise. After a few minutes, Dr. Sweeney turned and left the store, walking into the street, followed closely by Whalen. When the doctor made a sharp left turn, Whalen followed. When Whalen made the turn, Dr. Sweeney stood there waiting for him. Whalen felt embarrassed but turned around and walked away. Dr. Sweeney smiled and then introduced himself to the young rookie and stated, quote, "If we're going to be together so often, we might as well be acquainted," end quote. Now that Sweeney knew he was being followed, it really didn't matter. Dr. Sweeney continued to toy with the young man and other officers that continued to follow him. Lieutenant Coles took advantage of Sweeney being out on the streets and searched his office and his rooms for any evidence. The police even searched through his mail. Victims number 11 and 12, the man and woman discovered on August 16, 1938, signified a change in the killer's dumping ground. He never used the most recent one before, and authorities hoped that the Mad Butcher would, somehow, make a mistake and be caught. But Ness and Cowles doubted that the two most recent victims were actually murdered. It was then that the public and the politicians began to criticize Ness for his inability to catch the killer. In an effort to become more proactive, Ness led a raid on the so-called, quote, shanty towns, end quote, in Kingsbury Run. Disoriented hobos were chased down by the police, arrested, taken to the police station, and fingerprinted. Police also searched for the Mad Butcher, but found only worldly possessions of the unfortunates. In a desperate attempt to deny the killer of a hideout, Ness ordered the shanty town be burned to the ground. Newspapers criticized Ness for his aggressive tactics, but the burning of the hobo home showed the desperation of the investigation. Ness, feeling the pressure, decided to notify Lieutenant Cowles to bring in their only suspect, Dr. Sweeney, for a secret interrogation. Lieutenant Cowles gave Dr. Sweeney a choice. Either come in for the secret interrogation, or he would bring the physician down to the station, notifying the press of his arrest, and bring further embarrassment to his family. Dr. Sweeney chose the lesser of two evils. After sobering for 3 days, Eliot Ness, Lieutenant Cowles, court psychiatrist Dr. Royal Grossman, and the inventor of the polygraph machine, Dr. Leonard Keeler, appeared at the hotel. For the next 2 hours, on August 23, 1938, Lieutenant Cowles and Dr. Grossman conducted the interrogation of Dr. Sweeney. Sweeney played with the interrogators, and Ness knew it. Then, Ness escorted the confident doctor into the adjoining bedroom where Dr. Keeler had prepared his polygraph machine to test Dr. Sweeney. After several innocuous questions about whether he was Dr. Frank Sweeney and whether he knew Edward Andrazi, Dr. Keeler asked more specific questions. After approximately an hour, Keeler asked Dr. Sweeney to stay in the room with the machine while he met with Lieutenant Cowles and Dr. Grossman. Dr. Keeler confidently stated to the two men, quote, "Looks like he's your guy," end quote. Ness agreed with Dr. Keeler's assessment and then turned to Dr. Grossman and asked, quote, "What do you think?" end quote. Grossman answered, quote, "I believe we have a classic psychopath here with the likelihood of some schizophrenia. His father spent the last 3 years of his life locked up, a violent schizoid personality aggravated by chronic alcoholism," end quote. Ness then went into the bedroom where Dr. Keeler interrogated Dr. Sweeney. Sweeney turned to Ness and asked, quote, "Well, are you satisfied now?" end quote. Ness replied, quote, "Yes, I think you're the killer," end quote. Dr. Sweeney then approached Ness very slowly, leaned into his face, and stated very intimidatingly, quote, "Then prove it," end quote. Ness admitted years later that he never felt more terrified than when he was left alone in the suite with this, quote, "madman," end quote. Lieutenant Cowles, Dr. Keeler, and Dr. Grossman left the suite to get some coffee. Ness soon tracked down the trio and ordered Lieutenant Cowles back to the suite immediately. Dr. Keeler subsequently tested Dr. Sweeney several more times that day with the same result. but Ness knew that the case could be highly politically charged with Sweeney's relations, should they get involved, and only circumstantial evidence existed that pointed toward Dr. Sweeney as the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run. After the secret interrogation, Dr. Sweeney checked himself into various hospitals to receive treatment for his alcohol addiction. The physician stayed in hospitals from 1938. Although Dr. Sweeney was confined to these various institutions, he still roamed the neighborhoods surrounding their grounds and wrote prescriptions for he and his friends until authorities notified local pharmacies, cutting off his supply. Dr. Sweeney died in 1965.
Dr. Frank Sweeney never let Eliot Ness forget that the once famous crime fighter may have had the Mad Butcher within his grasp, but failed to prove his case. Dr. Sweeney sent Ness postcards every year taunting him. The serial killings known as the Torso murders officially ended in 1938. Some historians and investigators have tried to implicate the Mad Butcher in other murders around the country at the time. Corpses found with the same signature in Pennsylvania, Ohio, New York, and even California demonstrated some similarities, but concrete evidence that the Mad Butcher was responsible lacked sufficiently so that Dr. Gerber dismissed the other cases as having been committed by the Cleveland Torso Killer. Some historians have even gone as far as to pin the Black Dahlia murder of Elizabeth Short to his list of accomplishments. They make this accusation without much tangible evidence at all. Although some murders with the similar signatures could be traced back as far as 1921 and as recently as 1950, these murders were never proved to be the work of the Torso Killer of Cleveland. As a result of an investigation in which a private detective conducted at the behest of Martin Sweeney to clear his cousin, Dr. Frank Sweeney, one other suspect surfaced to the Kingsbury Run murders, a man named Frank Dolezal. The private detective, Pat Lyons, discovered a tavern where Dolezal, Andrassi, the first victim, and Florence Polillo frequented. When detectives searched Dolezal's room, they found some bloodstains and a knife later confirmed to be that of human blood. Dolezal had a relationship with the third victim, Frances Polillo, and he maintained that Polillo attacked him with a butcher knife and he merely protected himself. As a result of the struggle, Polillo fell and hit her head on the side of the bathtub. Dolezal admitted, probably while under the influence of alcohol, that he cut Polillo up into smaller pieces and placed her into separate burlap bags. Lyons pushed very, very hard to hold Dolezal as the suspect, but Detective Merillo had already cleared Dolezal of any involvement in the Torso killings. On August 24, 1939, Dolezal suspiciously died under questionable circumstances in his cell and therefore helped to close the case of the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run. Eliot Ness died in 1957 at the age of 54, penniless and an alcoholic, at his home in Soudersport, Pennsylvania. His ashes were scattered over a pond on his property. Until next time.
If you enjoyed our presentation of true crime, please like, subscribe, and hit the bell to receive notifications on any future programs.